The air inside Whitmore Manor was thick with the scent of dust and old wood, a silent testament to a house that had once been full of life but now stood on the edge of ruin. The vast estate, perched on the shores of a secluded Vermont lake, was a place where the wind howled through the trees, where shadows stretched long in the endless corridors, where silence was louder than any voice. At the heart of it all sat Theo Whitmore, a man who had once ruled boardrooms with an iron will but now found himself at war with something he couldn't control, his own failing body. Once towering in presence, Theo had withered under the weight of his disease, his broad frame now burdened with weakness. His once sharp blue eyes, which had sent shivers down the spines of rivals, now carried something foreign, fatigue. The world outside had already buried him. His stepmother, Charlotte Whitmore, had wasted no time in preparing for the inevitable. She and her son, James, moved through the house with an air of quiet entitlement, like heirs awaiting their inheritance. Charlotte spoke in hushed tones to lawyers, discussing estate matters as if the man still breathing in the upstairs wing no longer existed. James, ever the opportunist, had taken up residence in one of the manor's finer rooms, making himself comfortable in a future that had not yet arrived. Theo saw it all, and he despised them for it. Still, despite their vulture-like circling, Theo refused to surrender. His mind remained sharp even as his body betrayed him. He had built an empire from nothing, molded the world around him to his will. He would not simply lie down and fade away. And so, he made a decision. He would hire someone. Not just anyone, but someone competent, someone who wouldn't cower under his sharp tongue or bend under the weight of his reputation. The doctors had long since given up on offering solutions beyond false hopes and steady declines. He needed someone who wouldn't waste time with empty sympathies. His assistant, an aging but fiercely loyal man named Paul Dawson, stood in the dim study, awaiting orders. "Find me the best," Theo rasped, his voice edged with the last remnants of defiance. Paul hesitated. "The best won't come for what you're offering." Theo's lips curled into something resembling a smirk. "Then offer them a fortune." Paul nodded but did not move. "There's something else, sir." Theo arched a brow, irritation flickering in his dulling gaze. "Charlotte is already meeting with a team of doctors," Paul continued carefully. "She's pushing for different options." Theo clenched his jaw. He knew exactly what that meant. A quiet, comfortable exit. His fingers curled around the arm of his chair, knuckles white. "I'll make sure she waits a little longer." Paul gave a slight nod and left to fulfill his task. Theo leaned back, staring at the flickering fireplace. His body was failing, but his mind, his will, remained. He wasn't done yet. The scent of antiseptic and stale coffee filled the cramped nurse's lounge, a place where exhaustion lived in the hollow eyes of those who spent their nights tending to the sick and dying. Eleanor Ellie Carter sat at the edge of a worn-out chair, flipping through job listings on her phone, her fingers tapping the screen with quiet urgency. The hospital where she worked had been cutting hours, and she was already struggling to make rent. She had been here before, on the edge of uncertainty, balancing survival on a thin rope. A childhood spent in foster homes, group shelters, and cold beds that never truly felt like hers had made her adaptable, but the constant state of impermanence had left its scars. She had learned early on that self-reliance was the only thing keeping her from falling through the cracks. Ellie had always been good at masking fear with practicality, at pushing forward without looking back. It was what had carried her through nursing school, through long shifts in emergency rooms where life and death clashed under flickering fluorescent lights. It was what had kept her standing when the world tried to knock her down. But now, she was running out of options. Her eyes skimmed another low-paying home care job before a new listing caught her attention. Private care nurse wanted, exceptional pay, discretion required. The salary was an outrageous amount, enough to pull her out of the financial instability she had always known. Enough to finally breathe. Her pulse quickened as she clicked the contact information. 2 days later, she sat across from Paul Dawson, an older man with tired eyes and a businesslike demeanor. The interview was swift, efficient, and impersonal, a stark contrast to the overwhelming sum she was being offered. "You'll be responsible for Mr. Whitmore's daily care," Paul explained, watching her closely. He is not an easy man. You'll need patience. Ellie wasn't intimidated. She had dealt with difficult patients before. I can handle it. Paul hesitated, as if deciding whether to say more. There are family complications, he added carefully. They don't always have his best interests at heart. A warning. Ellie absorbed the information, but her decision had already been made. She had spent her life adapting, maneuvering around people who saw her as disposable. If this was a game of survival, she had been playing it since childhood. When do I start? She asked. Paul handed her an address. Whitmore Manor. Ellie had no idea she was about to step into a house of secrets, betrayals, and a man who would change her life in ways she never imagined. The Whitmore Manor loomed ahead, a relic of wealth and isolation, its stone facade weathered by time and neglect. Eleanor Carter tightened her grip on her duffel bag as she stepped out of the hired car, the chill of the Vermont air biting through her coat. The towering iron gates had groaned open moments earlier, as if reluctant to let her in. She squared her shoulders. This was just another job, another difficult patient, another set of challenges. But the moment she crossed the threshold, stepping into the vast, dimly lit entry hall, she knew this was different. The air inside was heavy, not just with dust, but with something else, something unseen but deeply felt. Before she could take in the full grandeur of the place, a voice, low and sharp as a blade, cut through the silence. You're late. Eleanor turned toward the sound, finding a man seated near the grand fireplace, his silhouette rigid, his gaze piercing despite the dim glow of the flames. Theodore Whitmore. She had seen pictures of him before, grainy news articles and financial reports, all featuring a man of power and cold calculation. But now, sitting in that chair, he looked like a ghost of himself. His once imposing frame was leaner, his skin paler. Yet, his presence was anything but weak. I wasn't given a set time, Eleanor replied, keeping her voice even. Theo arched a brow. Then you should have assumed the earliest possible one. So that's how this was going to go. Eleanor met his gaze, unwavering. If I'm expected to read minds, I'll have to charge extra. For a second, a flicker of something crossed Theo's face. Surprise, perhaps? Amusement? But it vanished just as quickly, replaced by the same ice-cold expression. You'll find no room for sarcasm here, Miss Carter. His voice was flat, as if testing her patience. Eleanor dropped her bag beside her feet. And you'll find no room for intimidation with me, Mr. Whitmore. Silence stretched between them, thick with an unspoken challenge. Theo studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he exhaled, the sharp edges of his features softening, only slightly. Paul spoke highly of you, he finally said. I assume you're competent, even if you have a mouth on you. Eleanor crossed her arms. You don't need to assume. You'll see for yourself. Theo smirked, but there was no warmth in it. We'll see, indeed. A test, then. She had expected nothing less. Paul appeared at the edge of the room, clearing his throat. Miss Carter's room is ready, he informed her before glancing at Theo. Shall I have dinner sent up? Theo waved a dismissive hand. Do what you want. Eleanor didn't miss the way Paul hesitated, watching Theo with something close to concern. This house was suffocating with unspoken things, and Eleanor had just stepped into the lion's den. The morning at Whitmore Manor was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt intentional, as if the walls themselves were listening. Eleanor Carter had spent her first night in the manor half awake, attuned to every creak and shift in the massive house. Now, as she carried a tray of carefully portioned breakfast to Theo's study, she reminded herself, this is just another job. Keep it professional. Keep your distance. But when she pushed the heavy door open, she found him staring at a single pill in his palm. His jaw was tight, his fingers curled around the small capsule as if weighing whether to take it. You planning on swallowing it? Or are we just admiring pharmaceuticals today? Eleanor asked, setting the tray down. Theo's gaze snapped to her, sharp but not entirely unamused. You're as insufferable in the morning as you were last night. Consistent, at least, she said, before nodding toward the pill. What is it? A lifeline, according to Dr. Langley. Theo's tone was clipped. Or perhaps just a leash. Eleanor frowned. You don't trust your doctor? Theo scoffed. I don't trust anyone, Ms. Carter. That, she already knew. But there was something deeper there. Something weighted and unspoken. She studied him carefully. The man who had challenged her the night before now sat in quiet hesitation, staring at a single pill like it held more than just chemicals. Eleanor hesitated before saying, Then why keep him as your doctor? Theo's lips pressed into a thin line. Because I'm not in a position to be selective. That struck something in her. She wasn't used to thinking of men like Theodore Whitmore as trapped. But he wasn't he? Trapped in this house. Trapped in his body. Trapped under the watchful eyes of people waiting for him to fade. For the first time since she arrived, Eleanor felt a flicker of understanding. Not sympathy. She wasn't foolish enough for that. But understanding. I'd rather trust my own instincts than any prescription, Theo muttered before tossing the pill into his mouth and swallowing it dry. Eleanor exhaled, crossing her arms. That's not how medicine works. Then I suppose you'll have to keep me alive despite my reckless behavior, he said, a ghost of a smirk appearing before vanishing just as quickly. Eleanor wasn't sure if that was a challenge or a plea. Either way, she wasn't going anywhere. The fire in Theo's study crackled softly, but the warmth barely touched the coldness that seemed to settle in his bones. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on him, a relentless reminder of how much weaker he had become. Eleanor stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, observing him with the same measured patience she always carried. She was never intrusive, never overtly sympathetic, and yet she noticed everything. That alone unsettled him. You're tense, she said. Theo let out a slow breath, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. A lifetime of experience will do that. Eleanor stepped closer, her gaze flicking to his hands, which trembled subtly, almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. Let me check something, she said, kneeling beside him without waiting for permission. Theo stiffened. I don't. But before he could protest, her fingertips brushed his wrist. A shock. Not pain, but something different, spread through his arm, traveling up his spine like a whisper of relief. The constant ache that had embedded itself into his body like an unwelcome companion lessened. Theo's breath hitched. Eleanor froze, her fingers hovering just above his skin, her own eyes widening slightly. The room felt too quiet, as if the very air had paused in recognition of something neither of them could explain. His mind raced to rationalize it. Was it a fluke? A momentary distraction? Some sort of psychosomatic response? But the relief was real, palpable, and for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he felt something other than pain. Eleanor, ever composed, quickly withdrew her hand. Too quickly. That's interesting, she said carefully, her voice betraying nothing. Theo exhaled slowly, flexing his fingers. The moment her touch was gone, the discomfort returned, faint, but noticeable. He clenched his jaw. Do it again. Eleanor hesitated. Theo. Again, he repeated, his voice low but firm. She placed her hand on his forearm this time, gentle but grounding. The same sensation returned, and Theo closed his eyes for half a second, letting himself feel it. Eleanor was the first to break the silence. I don't know what this means. Theo opened his eyes, his expression unreadable. Neither do I. But he knew one thing for certain. Whatever just happened between them, it wasn't nothing. Charlotte Whitmore moved through the halls of the Whitmore Manor like a specter, always watching, always calculating. She had perfected the art of manipulation long before Theo had ever been a challenge, and now, with his body failing him, she saw an opportunity. He was slipping, whether he admitted it or not. And if she played her cards right, he would be gone sooner rather than later. She found him in the study, sitting where he always did, staring at nothing, his mind likely lost in thoughts he refused to share. You look tired, darling, she said smoothly, stepping into the room. You shouldn't push yourself. Theo didn't bother looking at her. You're not concerned about my well-being, Charlotte. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. A practiced laugh. Oh, Theo, must you always assume the worst of me? He finally turned his head, his sharp eyes digging into her like knives.
Yes.
Charlotte sighed as if wounded, but her composure never wavered. Instead, she walked to the bar cart, pouring herself a drink, all while keeping a careful eye on him. I was only thinking of how vulnerable you are these days, she said, swirling the glass in her hand. It's not easy, relying on strangers. Theo stiffened, just barely, but enough for her to notice. Bingo. That nurse of yours, she continued, her tone light but suggestive. She's quite devoted, isn't she? Theo's fingers curled against the armrest. Charlotte smiled to herself. I do hope she's here for the right reasons. A young woman, working so closely with a man of your status. People do desperate things when money is involved. Theo's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. A crack in the armor. Charlotte didn't need him to believe her now, only to let the seed take root. Meanwhile, in the corridor, James Whitmore watched Eleanor. She had been avoiding him, but that only made it more entertaining. He liked watching people squirm. Miss Carter, he said, stepping into her path. You're quite the mystery around here. Eleanor held his gaze, unimpressed. And you're in my way. James smirked. I hear you have a talent for getting close to my dear brother. There was something off in the way he spoke, something too smooth, too rehearsed. Eleanor knew a warning when she heard one, and suddenly, she was very aware that she wasn't just working in a house full of secrets. She was trapped in one. The storm outside mirrored the tension inside Whitmore Manor. Restless, unpredictable, charged with something unspoken. Rain pattered against the tall windows of Theo's study, and the fire crackled low, casting flickering shadows across the room. Eleanor sat across from Theodore Whitmore, watching him with a quiet patience that unsettled him. She had a way of looking at him, not with pity, not with the expectation that he would break, but as if she saw past everything, past his reputation, past his sickness, past the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. And he hated it, or at least, he told himself he did. You don't have to linger, Theo muttered, shifting in his chair. Your job is done for the night. Eleanor leaned back, stretching her legs slightly, making no move to leave. And yet, here I am. Theo shot her a glare. I don't need a babysitter. No, she agreed. You just need someone to tell you when you're being an ass. His lips twitched, almost a smirk. For weeks now, he had tested her, pushed her, tried to drive her away with the same arrogance that had made him a force in business. But she never flinched. And that was the problem. Because Eleanor Carter was no longer just his nurse. She was becoming something else entirely. The air between them shifted, heavy with something unsaid. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying him. You ever get tired of the act? Theo stiffened. What act? The one where you pretend you don't care. The one where you act like none of this gets to you. She gestured vaguely at the room, the pills, the firelight that barely touched the exhaustion on his face. Theo exhaled sharply, his fingers pressing into the armrest of his chair. You have no idea what you're talking about. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. I do. I know what it's like to pretend you don't feel anything because the alternative is worse. For a long moment, he said nothing. Because she was right. He could feel it creeping in, the weight of what she was becoming to him. It was in the way his pulse reacted when she touched him, in the way he found himself listening to her voice even when he told himself he didn't care. He should have told her to leave. Instead, he held her gaze and said, Don't act like you're any different, Eleanor. She swallowed, but she didn't look away. And that was the moment he knew. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away. The dim light of the manor's hallway barely illuminated Eleanor Carter's face as she studied the small white pill in her palm. It was identical to the one she had been giving Theo every night. But something was wrong. The dosage was off. Her pulse quickened. She had noticed subtle changes in Theo's condition over the past few days. A deeper fatigue, more disorientation than usual. He had chalked it up to the progression of his illness, but Eleanor wasn't convinced. And now, she had proof. The medication had been switched. Her stomach twisted as she considered the implications. Who would want to alter his treatment? The answer came too easily. Charlotte. Eleanor clenched her fist around the pill and turned on her heel, heading straight for Theo's study. Theo glanced up when she entered, his expression unreadable. He had spent the last few days in a strange state, distant, guarded, less trusting. And now Eleanor had a sinking suspicion why. "I need to talk to you," she said, striding toward him. Theo exhaled tiredly. "By all means, enlighten me." Eleanor hesitated. She had never been one to dance around the truth, but something in his posture told her that he was already doubting her. She placed the pill bottle on his desk. "Your medication has been tampered with?" His jaw tightened. "That's a serious accusation. I double-checked your prescriptions. The dosage is different from what Dr. Langley initially prescribed." She met his gaze, unwavering. "Charlotte has access to your medication, Theo. She could be—" "Stop." His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like ice. Eleanor stilled. Theo pushed himself up from his chair, moving toward the fireplace. His hands trembled slightly, but it wasn't from his illness this time. "You think I don't know Charlotte plays games?" His tone was controlled, but beneath it, there was something raw. "You think I haven't spent years being aware of what she's capable of?" Eleanor took a step closer. "Then why won't you listen to me?" He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Because I don't know if I can trust you either." The words landed like a blow. Eleanor's breath caught. "You think I would do this?" Theo ran a hand over his jaw, his exhaustion evident. "I don't know what to think anymore." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Somewhere, Charlotte was winning. The storm outside had settled into a steady rhythm, rain tapping against the windows like a persistent whisper. Inside Whitmore Manor, the air was thick, not just with the scent of old books and firewood, but with something unspoken, unresolved. Eleanor Carter stood by the fireplace in Theo's study, arms crossed as she watched the flames dance. She should have left his room by now. The conversation they'd had earlier had unraveled something inside both of them. His doubts, her frustration, the weight of the war being waged between them. But she couldn't walk away. And neither could Theodore Whitmore. He sat in his chair, his usual composed demeanor now laced with something else. Exhaustion, frustration, fear. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face before speaking. "Do you ever think about it?" His voice was quieter than usual, almost raw. Eleanor glanced at him. "Think about what?" Theo's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest. "What it'll feel like when it happens." She didn't have to ask what he meant. Her chest tightened. Theo never talked about his illness like this. He deflected, he dismissed, he fought. But tonight, something had cracked. Eleanor took a slow breath. "I don't know." Theo's gaze lifted to hers, the flickering fire casting golden shadows over his sharp features. "Neither do I. And that terrifies me." The admission hung between them, heavy with its honesty. Eleanor swallowed, stepping closer. "You don't have to face it alone." Theo let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Don't I?" Eleanor hesitated before kneeling beside his chair, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "You're not alone," she said softly. "Even if you try to be." Theo's breath was uneven now, his guarded exterior crumbling in the silence. His hand twitched at his side, like he wanted to reach for her but didn't know how. She made the choice for him. Slowly, carefully, Eleanor placed her hand over his. Theo's fingers curled instinctively around hers, his grip firm but uncertain, as if he was grasping at something he wasn't ready to name. The tension between them shifted, turned into something deeper, something more dangerous. Eleanor's heart pounded as Theo's eyes dropped to her lips for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Then, without thinking, without hesitation, he kissed her. It wasn't soft. It wasn't careful. It was desperate, raw, unspoken emotions spilling into something tangible. Eleanor felt herself sinking into him, into the fire between them, into the truth neither of them could deny anymore. When they pulled away, breathless, the world had changed. There was no turning back now. The storm had passed, but Whitmore Manor was colder than ever. Eleanor stood in the center of Theo's study, her pulse pounding in her ears as Charlotte's voice dripped with carefully measured venom. "I warned you, Theo." Charlotte said, arms crossed in mock disappointment. These kinds of women always have an agenda. On the desk between them lay the evidence, a bank transfer in Eleanor's name, a sum she had never seen, never touched. A trap. Eleanor's breath was sharp, her chest tight as she turned to Theodore Whitmore, searching his face for something, anything, that suggested he knew the truth. But his eyes were unreadable. Theo sat stiffly, his hands clenched into fists, his features carved from stone. But she could see it, the doubt, the hesitation, the battle inside him. And then he made his choice. His voice was cold. Leave. The single word cut through her like a blade. Eleanor's throat burned. You know I didn't do this. Theo's jaw tightened. I don't know anything anymore. Charlotte sighed dramatically. It's a shame, really. She played the part so well. Eleanor's fists clenched at her sides. This is her doing, Theo. You know it. But he wasn't looking at her anymore. That was when she knew. She had fought for him, fought against him, fought beside him, and in the end, he had let her go. Paul was waiting at the door as she gathered her things, his expression dark with something close to regret. He didn't speak as he handed her an envelope, her final payment. Eleanor stared at it before shoving it back into his hands. Give it to her, she said, her voice shaking with restrained anger. She worked hard enough for it. She walked out without looking back. But as the door to Whitmore Manor slammed shut behind her, Theo sat alone in the dim firelight, staring at the flickering embers. The ache in his chest had nothing to do with his illness, and everything to do with the woman he had just let walk away. The city streets felt foreign beneath Eleanor's hurried steps. It had been days since she left Whitmore Manor, but the betrayal still clung to her skin like a second layer. She should have been trying to move on, to rebuild. But the weight in her chest refused to let her breathe. Then, she saw the email. At first, she thought it was a mistake, an automated notification from the hospital pharmacy where Theo's prescriptions were managed. But when she opened it, the words made her blood run cold. The medication had been altered, and not by accident. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she scrolled through the records. The dosage increases, the chemical adjustments. It wasn't Theo's disease that was worsening. Someone had been poisoning him. Charlotte. James. It was right in front of her. The perfect plan. Keep Theo just sick enough, just weak enough, until he was gone. And by then, no one would question it. Just another tragic loss of a man who had been dying for months. Eleanor's breath came in sharp bursts, her mind racing. She had to warn him. But how? Theo had already turned against her. If she showed up at Whitmore Manor, Charlotte would have her dragged out before she got a word in. And if she called, would Theo even listen? She needed proof. She needed a way back in. And there was only one person who might be reckless enough to help her. Her fingers hovered over her phone before she finally called. A groggy voice answered. Paul Dawson. Eleanor? His confusion was evident. I need you to listen, she whispered, already looking over her shoulder. If Charlotte or James realized she was onto them, she might not get another chance. She took a steadying breath and said, They're killing him. The Whitmore Manor loomed ahead, its dark silhouette barely visible beneath the fog that clung to the surrounding trees. Eleanor stood just beyond the gates, her pulse hammering in her ears. Getting in was dangerous, but letting Theo die wasn't an option. Paul had done his part, leaving a side door unlocked. The rest was up to her. She slipped inside, her footsteps careful against the cold marble floor. The house was quieter than she remembered, too quiet. And then she saw him. Theo sat slumped in his chair by the fireplace, his skin ashen, his breath shallow. Her chest tightened. He looked worse than when she left, far worse. The sight of him like this nearly shattered her, but she forced herself to move. She had to get him out of here. But before she could reach him, a voice cut through the silence. Well, back to finish the job? Eleanor whirled around. Charlotte. She stood in the doorway, her expression a perfect mask of smug satisfaction. Eleanor's heart pounded. This was a trap. You did this to him, Eleanor said, voice shaking with restrained fury. Charlotte clicked her tongue. You broke into an invalid's home after being caught stealing, and now you're making wild accusations? She let out a soft laugh. My dear, you're not very good at playing the victim. Eleanor took a step closer to Theo. He stirred, his eyelids fluttering. His gaze landed on her, confusion flickering in his tired eyes. Eleanor? Charlotte sighed dramatically. Oh, Theo. I knew she'd come back for more. Eleanor clenched her fists. You've been poisoning him. Charlotte gasped, feigning offense. How dare you suggest such a thing? She turned to Theo, shaking her head. You see? This is what she does. She's desperate, obsessed. Eleanor's throat burned with frustration. He couldn't believe this. Theo's gaze flickered between them, his breathing uneven. He was trying to piece it together. But before he could, James stepped into the room. Caught her in the act, did you? He mused, arms crossed. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Charlotte smirked. Call the police. James pulled out his phone. And just like that, the trap snapped shut. Eleanor couldn't move. James's fingers hovered over his phone screen. One call away from making this a nightmare she might not escape. Charlotte stood beside him, her expression a careful mixture of concern and triumph. Eleanor had seen a lot of lies in her life, but none so polished, so dangerously convincing. Across the room, Theo sat motionless, his breathing uneven, his once sharp eyes clouded with exhaustion. But he was watching, really watching, and something shifted in his gaze. Not confusion, not anger, recognition. Stop. Theo's voice was weak, but the command still carried weight. James hesitated. Charlotte's expression faltered, just slightly. Theo, darling, I said stop. Theo's fingers twitched against the armrest of his chair, as if he was trying to summon the strength he no longer had. His gaze never left Eleanor's. He saw it now. She wasn't the liar. They were. Eleanor exhaled shakily, stepping closer, not caring about the danger anymore. Theo, listen to me. They've been poisoning you. Slowly, methodically. It's why you've been getting worse. Charlotte laughed softly, the sound dripping with pity. Oh, the dramatics. You see now, Theo? She'll say anything. But Theo wasn't listening to Charlotte. His eyes were locked on Eleanor's, and she could see the war inside him. The realization, the anger, the regret. I should have believed you, he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. There wasn't time for blame now. I can fix this, she said, voice steady. But I need you to trust me. Theo's breathing hitched. Trust. A word that had never come easy to him. But as he looked at Eleanor, at the woman who had never wavered, never stopped fighting for him even when he had cast her aside. He realized there was no one else left to trust. His fingers brushed against hers, weak but deliberate. A choice. A promise. Eleanor tightened her grip around his hand, as if anchoring him to her, to reality. She turned back to Charlotte and James. If you call the police, you'd better pray they believe your version of events before I get a chance to speak. Because I have enough to tear this entire house of lies apart. Charlotte's smirk faltered. James's grip on his phone tightened. The game had changed, and Eleanor wasn't leaving without him. The tension in Whitmore Manor had thickened into something suffocating. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to disaster. Eleanor sat beside Theo's bed, her fingers lightly brushing his as she checked his pulse. His breathing was still shallow, his body weak. But there was something different now. Awareness. Resolve. Theo wasn't gone yet, and she wasn't going to let them finish the job. The door creaked open, and Dr. Richard Langley stepped inside, his usually impassive face lined with something she had never seen before. Guilt. You were right, he said quietly, his voice strained. I should have seen it sooner. Eleanor's heart pounded. Then help me. Langley exhaled sharply, glancing at Theo, who was watching him carefully. I will. Eleanor barely had time to feel relief before Theo's fingers weakly curled around hers. When she turned back to him, his eyes, clouded with exhaustion, but steady, held her in place. If we get out of this, his voice was rough, almost hesitant, almost vulnerable. I need you to know. Eleanor swallowed. Theo. His hand tightened slightly around hers. I was a fool to doubt you, to push you away. But if there's one thing I've learned from this, his voice faltered, but his gaze never left hers. It's that I can't lose you again. Eleanor felt something splinter inside her. She had told herself not to get attached. She had reminded herself over and over again that this wasn't her fight. But it was a lie. Because this man, this impossible, infuriating, brilliant man, had found his way into her heart long before she had realized it. So she didn't hesitate. She leaned in, pressing her forehead to his, her fingers brushing his cheek. Then we get out of this. Together. A quiet promise. A fragile, desperate moment that neither of them could afford to lose. But the door slammed open. Charlotte stood in the doorway, her expression carefully composed. But the flicker of fury in her eyes was unmistakable. Well, she said, voice like silk, isn't this touching? Behind her, James loomed, his smirk razor-sharp. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Charlotte knew. And just like that, their chance at escape had been ripped away. The moment Charlotte Whitmore stepped into the room, Eleanor knew. Something in Charlotte's eyes, calculated, assured, sent ice crawling down her spine. She wasn't here to threaten anymore. She was here to finish it. Theo lay in the bed, his body still weakened, his breathing shallow but steady. He was defenseless, and Charlotte knew it. Eleanor tensed as she saw the small glass vial in Charlotte's hand. The liquid inside was clear, almost innocent-looking. But Eleanor had seen enough in her career to recognize a fatal dose when she saw one. This was it. Charlotte smiled, her fingers uncapping the syringe with a practiced elegance. You should have stayed gone, dear. Eleanor's pulse roared in her ears. James stood by the door, arms crossed, his smirk oozing arrogance. You're too late, sweetheart. We win. No, not like this. Eleanor didn't think. She lunged. Her shoulders slammed into Charlotte, sending the syringe clattering to the floor just inches away from Theo's arm. Charlotte stumbled, shock flashing across her face before fury took over. You insufferable little. Eleanor didn't let her finish. She grabbed Charlotte's wrist, twisting hard, forcing her back. James moved toward them, but before he could reach her, a sharp voice rang out. Enough. The word wasn't loud, but it was authoritative, enough to freeze them all. Eleanor turned. Theo was awake. His breathing was ragged, but his eyes, sharp, clear, furious, locked onto Charlotte. For the first time, she faltered. Theo pushed himself up, every movement slow but deliberate. He was weak, but he was done being helpless. You tried to kill me, he said, his voice like gravel. Charlotte straightened her dress, masking her unease with a small smile. Darling, you're not well. You're confused. Theo's gaze flicked to the fallen syringe, then to Eleanor, who was still bracing for a fight. Then, finally, back to Charlotte. No, he said, his voice cold as steel. I finally see everything clearly. James scoffed. Oh, please. What are you going to do, Theo? Theo's fingers tightened on the bedsheet. Then, the sound of footsteps filled the hall. James turned just as Paul stepped inside, followed by Dr. Langley, and behind them, 2 uniformed police officers. Charlotte's face drained of color. Eleanor exhaled, her entire body shaking. They had won. And Theo, against all odds, against the betrayal and poison and pain, was still alive. The room was thick with tension, the weight of everything hanging in the air like an impending storm. Dr. Langley stepped forward, his expression grim but resolute as he handed over a file, thick with medical reports, lab results, and undeniable proof. Theo's condition didn't deteriorate naturally, Langley said, his voice firm. These test results show consistent exposure to a toxic substance, one that matches the altered medication he's been taking. Eleanor stole a glance at Theo, who sat upright now, pale but unshaken. His hands trembled slightly against the sheets, but his eyes never left Charlotte. James, on the other hand, tensed. You don't have proof that we had anything to do with that, James said quickly, his voice tight. For all you know, it was a mistake. Langley shook his head. It wasn't. And I have prescription logs showing unauthorized changes to Theo's medication orders. Changes made under Charlotte's authority. A beat of silence. Then, Charlotte laughed softly, shaking her head. This is absurd. Eleanor saw it, the first crack in her composure. You played the part well, Eleanor said, her voice steady. But it's over. Charlotte's expression darkened, but it was James who made the first move. Before anyone could react, he bolted for the door. One of the officers moved fast, blocking his path. James pivoted sharply, shoving past Paul, but the other officer tackled him before he could make it down the hall. A chaotic struggle, the sound of scuffling feet, a sharp grunt, and then James was face down, handcuffed, his curses muffled against the floor. Theo barely blinked. His focus remained on Charlotte, who hadn't moved. For the first time, there was no carefully constructed act. No false warmth, no feigned concern. Just cold, sharp calculation. She adjusted the sleeve of her expensive dress. This is a mistake. The lead officer stepped forward. Charlotte Whitmore, you're under arrest for attempted murder. I wouldn't finish that sentence. Charlotte cut in smoothly, her voice eerily calm. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Even now, she thought she could control the outcome. But Theo was done. He finally spoke, his voice steady, deliberate, final. You tried to kill me. Charlotte's gaze flickered, just barely. I will make sure you rot for it. Eleanor saw it then, the moment Charlotte knew she had lost. As the officers led them both away, Theo exhaled, slow and controlled. It was over, and he was still here. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the hospital room. Eleanor Carter sat motionless, her fingers curled around Theo's limp hand, her other hand gripping the edge of the chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. After everything, after the betrayal, the poison, the fight for survival, he had won. They had won. But now, he was slipping away. The doctors had warned her. His body had been weakened for too long. The stress, the poisoning, the trauma of the past few days, it had finally taken its toll. And now he was here, suspended somewhere between life and death, trapped in a battle that Eleanor couldn't fight for him. Her chest tightened as she looked at him, his strong features now drawn and pale, his body still as the machines did the work his body struggled to do. You're not allowed to leave, she whispered, her voice shaking. She had spent years teaching herself not to rely on anyone. She had learned, over and over again, that the people she cared for always left. But not him, not Theo Whitmore. She let out a broken laugh, brushing a damp strand of hair from his forehead. He had fought her from the start, tested her, pushed her away, and she had fought back. Because somewhere in that cold, infuriating, impossible man, she had seen something worth saving. And now she realized how much she needed him. Her throat burned. You're too stubborn to die, she murmured. You'd never let Charlotte win. So you sure as hell aren't letting this take you down either. No response. The monitors kept beeping, the oxygen machine releasing a quiet, rhythmic hiss. Eleanor swallowed hard, leaning closer, her forehead nearly brushing his temple. I should have told you, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of it. The truth that had been clawing at her for weeks, the truth she had been too afraid to name. I love you. The words felt too small, too fragile for what she felt for him. But they were real. She clutched his hand tighter, her breath unsteady. She had lost too much in her life. She couldn't lose this too. And so, she did something she had never done before. She closed her eyes and prayed for him to come back to her. The first thing Theo Whitmore registered was the weight. A soft, familiar pressure wrapped around his fingers, warm, grounding. Then came the sound, the rhythmic beeping of a monitor, the low hum of the oxygen machine, and a voice, soft, frayed at the edges. A voice he knew better than his own. Please, Eleanor whispered, barely audible. Come back. Theo tried to move, but his body felt heavy, uncooperative. He fought against the haze, the exhaustion pulling him under. He was used to controlling things, to bending the world to his will. But this was different. And then, he felt something else. Fingers tightening around his. His chest burned with the effort as he forced his dry lips apart and spoke the only name that mattered. Eleanor. The sound was barely above a breath, but it shattered the silence. A gasp, the scrape of a chair against the floor. Then, warm hands cupped his face, a touch so desperately familiar that he felt the weight in his chest loosen for the first time in days. Theo, Eleanor choked out, her voice thick with disbelief, relief, something deeper. His eyelids were heavy, but he forced them open, and there she was. Her face was pale, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion, but she was still the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Thought I told you," he rasped, his throat dry. "Not to babysit me." A sharp, breathless laugh left her lips, part disbelief, part absolute relief. "You almost died, and that's the first thing you say?" Theo smirked, or tried to. It felt weak, but it was there. "I had to make sure you weren't getting too comfortable." Her hands trembled against his jaw. "You scared me." His eyes softened. "You stayed." Eleanor swallowed hard, blinking rapidly, as if she was barely holding herself together. "Of course I did." Theo wanted to say more, to tell her everything, to let her know that he felt it too, that he had been falling for her long before he was ready to admit it. But before he could, she leaned in, pressing her forehead to his, her breath unsteady. And that was enough. For now, 2 weeks later, the wind was crisp as Theo stood at the edge of the Whitmore estate, staring at the home he had spent a lifetime building, and a lifetime being trapped inside. "Are you sure?" Paul asked, watching him carefully. Theo nodded, his grip tightening on the signed documents in his hand. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said. His empire, his wealth, his legacy. He was walking away from it all. Some would call it reckless, but he finally understood what mattered. Behind him, Eleanor was waiting, and for the first time in his life, Theo Whitmore was ready to start over. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict. Charlotte Whitmore sat poised, her mask of composure barely intact. Beside her, James shifted uneasily, his hands clenched into fists. Charlotte Whitmore and James Whitmore. The judge's voice carried through the tense room. "You have been found guilty of attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt Theo's fingers brush against hers, a subtle but deliberate touch, a silent confirmation that it was finally over. Charlotte's lips parted, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she had no control. James, however, let his anger boil over. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, pushing up from his chair. "We're the victims here. Do you know who we are?" The judge barely spared him a glance. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore. And that's precisely why you're being held accountable." A moment later, the bailiffs moved, securing the handcuffs around James's wrists. Charlotte didn't fight, perhaps knowing it was futile. As they were led away, Eleanor let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Theo remained silent beside her, his jaw tight, his shoulders tense. He had won, but at what cost? Eleanor turned to him, searching his face. "It's done." Theo's gaze flicked to her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he let out a slow, relieved breath. "Yeah," he murmured. "It is." 1 month later, the Whitmore estate was nothing more than a memory now. Theo stood on the small wooden porch of their new home, a quiet lake house far from the world that had once consumed him. He watched as Eleanor unpacked a box, tucking books into a small shelf by the window. The sight of her there, so effortlessly part of this new life, settled something in his chest. She glanced up and caught him watching. "You're staring." Theo smirked. "Can you blame me?" Eleanor rolled her eyes but smiled as she crossed the room, stopping just in front of him. "How does it feel?" Theo considered her words. How did it feel to leave everything behind? The power, the name, the empire? He looked around, taking in the small space filled with warmth, with peace, with her, and he realized, for the first time in his life, he wasn't missing anything. He exhaled, threading his fingers through hers. "Like I finally started living." Eleanor's eyes softened, and she leaned into him, pressing her forehead against his. Good, she whispered, because this was their new beginning. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth as it drifted through the open windows of the lake house. The soft hum of crickets echoed in the distance, blending with the rhythmic lapping of water against the shore. Eleanor stood by the fireplace, running her fingers along the worn edges of an old book, pretending to read. But her mind wasn't on the pages, it was on Theo. She could feel him watching her from across the room. Their new life had been quiet, simple, free from the shadows that had once surrounded them. But there was something left unfinished, something between them that had been simmering for weeks, waiting for one of them to break the silence. And then, he moved. Theo crossed the room in slow, deliberate strides until he was standing behind her. Close enough that she could feel his warmth, the steady presence of him. "Are you going to keep pretending to read?" he murmured. Eleanor smiled, her heart hammering as she set the book down. "Are you going to keep pretending you're not staring?" Theo exhaled a quiet laugh, and then his hands found her waist, gentle, careful, testing. Eleanor didn't pull away. She turned in his arms, facing him fully. The firelight cast shadows across his sharp features, highlighting the storm in his blue eyes, the longing, the hesitation, the question. She reached up, her fingers tracing along his jaw, as if memorizing every inch of him. "No more running," she whispered. Theo's breath hitched. His grip on her waist tightened, as if anchoring himself, as if he was finally allowing himself to want this, to want her. "Not anymore," he murmured. And then he kissed her. This time, there was no desperation, no uncertainty, only heat, only need, only the undeniable truth that they had always been heading toward this moment. Eleanor melted into him, letting herself feel everything, the strength in his touch, the way his lips moved against hers like he had been waiting for this just as long as she had. They had fought each other, fought for each other, and now there was nothing left to fight. Theo lifted her effortlessly, carrying her toward the bedroom, their laughter mingling with the night air, their whispered promises filling the space between heartbeats. No more fear, no more doubts, only them. The lake house had been their sanctuary, a place of healing and quiet renewal, but Theo Whitmore had never been the type to remain still for long. Neither had Eleanor Carter. They had spent months adjusting to a life that was finally theirs, one without manipulation, without fear, without the weight of old expectations. But as the days passed, an unspoken understanding settled between them. Survival was not enough. They had been given a second chance, and it was time to do something with it. Theo stood on the grounds of what would soon become his legacy, staring at the skeletal remains of an old hospital that had been abandoned for years. The building was worn, its windows cracked, its walls scarred by time, but it still stood. Just like him, he had once poured his wealth into building an empire that had left him cold and detached from the world. Now, he would use that same fortune to create something different, something that mattered. A clinic for terminal patients, a place where people wouldn't be left to die alone, where dignity and care wouldn't be privileges but guarantees. Eleanor walked up beside him, her arms crossed against the late autumn chill, eyes scanning the property with a quiet intensity. "It's got potential," she murmured, a small smile tugging at her lips. Theo smirked. "That's a polite way of saying it looks like hell." She nudged him with her elbow. "I'm trying to be optimistic. But yes, it looks like hell. Still, if anyone can turn it into something worthwhile, it's you." Her faith in him was something he was still learning to accept. For so long, he had been surrounded by people who either feared him or wanted something from him. Eleanor had never asked for anything, had never expected him to be more than he was, and yet, she had been the one to change him the most. "You know this won't be easy," he said, watching her reaction carefully. "It'll take time, resources. You'd have to run it." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her brows lifting. "Me? You're the best person for it," he said simply. "You know how to fight for people when no one else will. You understand what it's like to feel powerless. And you won't let this place become just another institution." She was silent for a long moment, considering. Then, a slow smile spread across her lips, something fierce and determined in her eyes. If we do this, she said, we do it right. Full-time medical staff. Patient advocacy. We take in the people no one else wants to help. Theo nodded, his grip tightening around the papers in his hands. The final contracts that would put his plan in motion. Whatever it takes. A few months ago, he never would have imagined this. Giving away his wealth, his power, trading his name for something that no longer revolved around control. But now, standing beside Eleanor, knowing that they were about to build something that truly mattered, he realized this was the first time in his life that he felt free. Construction began within the month. The project moved fast, backed by Theo's still formidable influence and resources. Eleanor took on her role as director of the Whitmore Clinic with relentless dedication, assembling a team of doctors, nurses, and caregivers who understood that their work wasn't about prolonging life at any cost. It was about making the time people had left meaningful. Word spread quickly about what they were building. At first, skepticism followed. The Whitmore name had once been synonymous with ruthless business tactics, not philanthropy. But when the first patients arrived, when families saw the way their loved ones were treated, with warmth, with dignity, everything changed. Theo watched it unfold from the background, preferring to let Eleanor take the lead, though she never let him disappear completely. He still handled negotiations, still made sure that no one could interfere with what they were building. And every time Eleanor stepped into a patient's room, offering comfort in ways no amount of money ever could, he knew without a doubt this was what they were meant to do. One evening, long after the last of the visitors had left and the clinic had settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm, Theo found Eleanor standing in the doorway of one of the patients' rooms, watching as an elderly woman drifted off to sleep. He leaned against the wall beside her, tilting his head slightly. "You're still here," she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "So are you." He shrugged. "I go where you go." Eleanor turned to him then, her gaze softer than he was used to. "Are you happy, Theo?" The question caught him off guard. Happiness had always been an abstract concept to him, something people chased but never truly found. But here, now, standing in a place they had built together, with her by his side, he thought maybe he finally understood it. "I think I am," he said, reaching for her hand. "Are you?" Eleanor laced her fingers through his, squeezing gently. "Yeah," she whispered. "I think I am too." And as they stood there, the quiet hum of life continuing around them, they both knew they had found exactly where they were meant to be. The lake stretched out before them, its surface calm, mirroring the soft hues of the evening sky. The air carried the crisp scent of pine, mingling with the fading warmth of the setting sun. It was quiet here, the kind of quiet that settled into the soul rather than pressing down on it. Theo Whitmore sat at the edge of the dock, his feet dangling just above the water, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing along the grain of the wood. Beside him, Eleanor Carter leaned back on her hands, her gaze fixed on the sky as the first stars began to flicker into existence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. It had taken them so long to get here. Through battles neither of them had expected to fight, through betrayals, through near death, through losses that had stripped them down to nothing. And yet, somehow, they had found their way back to each other. Eleanor tilted her head, studying Theo's profile. The sharp lines of his face had softened slightly in the months since they left the Whitmore estate. He no longer carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders, no longer walked as though waiting for the next blow to fall. There was a lightness in him now, subtle but unmistakable. "You're staring again," Theo murmured, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Eleanor rolled her eyes but didn't look away. "You keep acting surprised by it." "Not surprised," he admitted, turning his head to meet her gaze. "Just wondering what's going on in that complicated brain of yours." Eleanor exhaled, tilting her chin toward the lake. "Just thinking how much has changed. How much we have changed." Theo hummed in agreement, shifting slightly so that their shoulders brushed. "I'd say you're the one who changed everything." She arched a brow. "Me?" He reached out, taking her hand, his thumb running over the inside of her wrist, a habit he had developed without realizing, a reminder that she was real, that she had stayed. "A touch," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "That's all it took." Eleanor thought back to that night in his study, the first time she had placed her hands on his skin, the first time he had let himself feel something other than pain. It had been a moment of instinct, an attempt to help, but it had become so much more than that. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. I didn't know what it meant back then. Theo's fingers laced through hers. Neither did I. Silence stretched between them again. But this time, it was full. Eleanor let her head fall against his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. This was the man who had once built walls so high even he had believed no one could scale them. And now? Now, he was just here. With her. Completely. Theo? She hesitated before speaking. Do you ever regret it? Walking away from it all? She felt his chest rise and fall with a slow, measured breath. No. She smiled, closing her eyes. Because neither did she. The waves lapped gently beneath them, a quiet melody of things lost and things found. The stars above gleamed brighter now, their reflection shimmering in the dark water below. Eleanor turned slightly, pressing a kiss to Theo's shoulder. He sighed, a quiet sound of contentment, before shifting to pull her into his arms. For the first time in both their lives, there was no uncertainty, no fear, no waiting for something to go wrong. Just this. And this was everything.